This is Tim O'Brien reporting to you from Seattle on October 30th, 2025. Today's security story is that new physical attacks are quickly diluting secure enclave defenses from NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel. There's a new attack called T.fail, that's TEE.fail, and it defeats the latest trusted execution environment protections from all three major chip makers. This attack uses a small piece of hardware placed between a memory chip and a motherboard slot, plus a kernel compromise. Unlike previous attacks that only worked on DDR4, T.fail works on DDR5 memory, affecting the latest CPUs and GPUs. This attack costs less than $1,000 in off-the-shelf equipment and can be completed in about 3 minutes. The root cause is deterministic encryption used by all three vendors, which produces the same ciphertext each time. Why this matters: trusted execution environments are everywhere: blockchain, cloud services, AI, finance, and defense. Many companies like Meta, Signal, Anthropic, and Microsoft rely heavily on these protections. The problem is that while chip makers exclude physical attacks from their threat models, many users and vendors make public claims suggesting trusted execution environments protect against physical access. This creates a dangerous gap between perception and reality. As security researcher H.D. Moore put it, if you are expecting TEEs to provide private computing in untrusted data centers, these attacks should change your mind. For more information, see the show notes for links. Today's programming language story is not necessarily technical. It's political. And I apologize. I'm trying to steer clear of politics because it's a very dangerous topic these days. But here we go. Python had a plan to boost software security, but it was foiled by the new rules against anti-DEI. So the Python Software Foundation rejected a $1.5 million grant from the National Science Foundation. The grant was intended to boost software security in the Python ecosystem. Fairly important, given that Python is at the center of a lot of the AI work that we're doing. The rejection came after the NSF added requirements that grantees cannot operate any DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. This is part of the broader administration directive targeting DEI initiatives in federally funded organizations. The Python Foundation decided that accepting the grant with those conditions would compromise their values. Today's Weird Bucket story is fairly weird. A man accidentally got a leech up his nose, and it took him 20 days to figure it out. A man in his 60s had a leech lodged in his nasal cavity for 20 days. He went swimming in a stream and later experienced nosebleeds and a foreign body sensation. Multiple doctors could not initially diagnose the problem. When the leech was finally discovered and removed, it was still alive and measured about 3 inches, 3 inches long. The patient made a full recovery after the leech was extracted. So listen, this is today's Weird Bucket news story, and if you want more information on this, God knows why you would want more information on this one, there is a link in the show notes. But I can tell you what this does. It amps up the level of OCD that I have. I may never swim in the water again. So we usually only cover 3 news stories a day, but there's more today. NVIDIA hit $5 trillion in terms of market valuation, and CEO Jensen Huang dismissed concerns that we're in an AI bubble. The stock has been climbing on the back of massive demand for AI chips, and Huang's experience is essentially that we're still in early stages of AI transformation, not approaching a peak. On one hand, congratulations. On the other hand, wow. Next news story is not a fun one. Amazon had a massive layoff yesterday. They're laying off approximately 14,000 employees. That's about 4% of their corporate and tech workforce. These layoffs are hitting multiple departments: cloud computing, devices, advertising, Prime Video, HR, operations, Alexa, and AWS. This represents one of the largest single-round layoffs in tech this year, and it's explicitly being framed as a shift towards AI and automation. So the tech industry has always been cyclical. I actually think a lot of these layoffs are related more to the economy than to AI. But it doesn't make it any easier for the people who got those notices yesterday. So if you know someone who's been affected, reach out, be helpful, and remember that the person that you help today might be the person who helps you tomorrow. I think it's time for us to come together as a profession and support each other. So that's today's news. And if you're interested in any of these stories, again, see the show notes for links. There's one more thing to talk about today, and that's a FinOps story that jumped up on my radar. And I want to make sure you know, before I shift gears to FinOps, for those of you who don't know, I have some experience in this area. I'm a member of the FinOps Foundation. And I'm working on a larger piece that's a reaction to David Heinemeier Hansen's posts in this space. And I think I'll just say up front, it's a really complicated discussion. It's the discussion about the cost of public cloud versus the cost of private cloud. Today, I came across a story from One Uptime by Neil Patel. It's a 2-year follow-up to their first AWS to bare metal migration, and they're reporting that they now save over $1.2 million per year. That's up from the initial estimate of $230,000 that they reported in the original post. First, I want to start by saying this is great. It's always good news when people demonstrate and document savings. They've been running their bare metal setup for 730 plus days with 4 nines of availability, 99.993%. They've added a second rack in Frankfurt, and they've reinvested savings into AI servers. That's real infrastructure. I respect this. I don't want anyone to take what I'm about to say as taking away from their success. But I do have 2 pieces of feedback. The first is, before everybody gets carried away and says, oh, private cloud is 20 times cheaper than public cloud, it isn't. If you do all the math, if you add it all together, it depends on the workload. It can definitely be a cost advantage for certain workloads. But there are other workloads that make no sense to move over. And Neil even acknowledges this in his piece. The other thing I want to say is, this is a great blog post. Again, I applaud Neil for saving money, but as a skeptical observer, I am not seeing the whole picture. I would love to see the whole financial picture that would back up this decision, but doing so would probably require him to share things he's not able to share. One of them is, what agreements do you have with your public cloud providers? Are there any discounts at play? I'd also like to see that full picture of the staff. If you run a company that is building a platform on top of public cloud and your workloads are fairly static, then yes, I agree. Moving to private cloud is a definite win. If you have a IaaS approach to public cloud, then you are also spending a considerable amount of your time worrying about VMs and worrying about security updates. If, on the other hand, you use public cloud and take advantage of some of the platforms that it offers, there's going to be some cost differences, but you're going to see some benefits in terms of staffing pressure. Again, I want to reiterate, I'm happy for One Uptime, but I also think that the conversation is very complicated. And I think someone needs to write a piece about all of the math that's involved in this comparison. But again, I encourage you to read Neil's post. I encourage you to give me any feedback you have and go look at the show notes for links to Neil's post. The focus of today's episode is a piece that I wrote a few weeks ago, and the title was It's More Complicated Than That. And I think it needs more unpacking because it's one of those topics that seems straightforward on the surface, but gets really messy when you dig in. And it's one of those topics that's a bit of a puzzle. Whenever I'm at the FinOps Foundation and someone talks to me about utilization, I look at them and I say, it's more complicated than that. And I don't really have time to talk to them for 14 or 15 hours about what I mean. But the basic premise of that post was FinOps teams love their utilization reports. They run these reports and they show servers running at 15% capacity. Databases are sitting idle and they think, look, we can save all the money here. But the reality is that acting on these reports without understanding the context is like performing surgery with a chainsaw. I listed out 7 different scenarios where teams push back on optimization efforts. Things like, quote, if that system goes down again, we're going to lose our customers permanently. Or, quote, we're in year 4 of moving customers off the system. So yes, utilization is low, but it's temporary. Can you leave me alone? End of quote. Each of those responses represents a legitimate operational reality that a simple percentage can't really capture. The point is that FinOps at scale isn't just about pointing to utilization figures. It's about deeply understanding operational realities and partnering closely with teams to achieve genuine, sustainable savings. You can't just throw a report at a problem and expect it to be solved. So let me expand on this a bit with some industry context. The statistics on server utilization are shocking, and they come from multiple credible sources. According to Gartner's 2022 analysis, server utilization rates are often less than 50% and can be as low as 20%. The source for that is the Gartner 2022 data center analysis. And that's from one of the most respected technology research firms in the world, the Uptime Institute. They're the folks that certify data centers. They found many data centers operate at an average of 20 to 30% server utilization. Wi-Fi Talents aggregates multiple industry reports and puts the average even lower at 12 to 18%. Meanwhile, David Kopp's research notes break this down by data center type. Internal and small data centers averaged at about 11% back in 2014, and they're projected to hit 20% by 2027. Co-location data centers do a little better. They averaged 21% in 2014 with projections of 35% by 2027. And hyperscale data centers, your Amazons, your Googles, they're running at about 40 to 45 or 50% utilization. That last stat is again from David Kopp's research notes. But I'll make an observation. Those numbers are all over the map. Less than 50, 12, 40, 35. We'll talk a little bit later about why CPU percentage is a bad metric. Here's what's also interesting about these numbers. They're remarkably consistent in that they all point to underutilization. But I want to talk about what these utilization statistics mean, because it's one of the most abused metrics in the industry. Every single FinOps vendor that's trying to sell you a tool, every optimization tool salesperson, they'll wave these numbers at you like a red flag. Your servers are only 20% utilized. Think of all the money you're wasting. But as we've discussed, that utilization percentage is meaningless. And the waste might actually be necessary insurance, flexibility, or just the way that the workload runs. So let me talk about databases specifically, because this is where utilization reports really fall apart, especially CPU percentages. There are several types of databases where low utilization isn't just acceptable, it's expected and sometimes necessary. First, you've got your disaster recovery or standby databases. These are systems that might sit at near zero for months, but when the primary database fails at 3 a.m. during a Black Friday event, that wasted capacity becomes the most valuable resource in your entire infrastructure. You can't optimize away your insurance policy. Then there are OLAP and data warehousing systems. These databases might see huge spikes during the month, or in some cases, they might have one spike a day, but that one spike is worth a lot of money. And when the executive team needs their dashboards, or when another team needs that daily summary, that's going to get some utilization, but they're relatively quiet for the rest of the time. You size them for those peak analytical workloads, not for the average Tuesday afternoon. So if you throw me an average over the week for the percentage for that database, it might be 1%, but it's worth it. Multi-tenant NoSQL databases present another challenge. When you're running databases that serve multiple customers with wildly different usage patterns, you have to provision for the aggregate peak, not the average. One customer might be running their Super Bowl ad campaign while another is in their quiet season. From my experience and industry patterns, these systems often need 2 to 3 times the average capacity to handle those variations. And in some NoSQL databases, you're not sizing for anything other than the speed of the response. And sometimes that requires over-provisioning. So if you look at databases, especially massive NoSQL databases, and you're going to apply CPU utilization numbers to them, that's not going to tell you anything. So let's talk about the CPU utilization lie. And before we dive into real-world complications, I want to address something fundamental. CPU utilization percentages are basically a lie. Brendan Gregg, he's the guy who literally wrote the textbook on system performance. And if you need a link to that, look at the show notes. He has a brilliant blog post, which is now a couple years old, called CPU Utilization is Wrong. That completely changed how I think about this metric. And again, that is a blog post you should read. If you're on a FinOps team or on any team and you're looking at CPU utilization reports, read that blog post. Here's the problem. When your monitoring tool says your CPU is at 80% utilization, what does that actually mean? In the old days, when I went to college with a 486DX computer, an IBM PS2, that was a single processor, and it was simple. 80% meant that my CPU was busy 80% of the time. But with modern multi-core processors, hyperthreading, and dynamic frequency scaling, that percentage is meaningless. Think about it this way. With hyperthreading, you might have 16 physical cores presenting as 32 logical cores. When the system reports 50% utilization, Are half the physical cores fully loaded? Are all cores running at half capacity? Are the hyperthreads engaged? The answer is you have no idea. You're just looking at a percentage number. And it gets worse with turbo boost and dynamic frequency scaling. A CPU running at 50% utilization at 4.5 gigahertz is doing way more work than the same CPU at 50% utilization at 2 gigahertz. But your utilization report doesn't show you that. It's like measuring how fast you are driving by what percentage of the time your foot is on the gas pedal. It tells you almost nothing useful. Greg points out that you can have systems showing high CPU utilization that are actually memory bound or IO bound, and this happens a lot in databases. The CPU is busy, but it's busy waiting for data, not doing useful work. So when someone shows you a utilization report showing your CPUs at 15%, that might mean you're wasting resources, or it might mean that your CPUs are efficiently handling the workload at lower frequencies to save power. This is why sophisticated operation teams look at instructions like instructions per cycle, memory bandwidth utilization, and actual throughput, not just CPU percentages. But guess what most utilization reports show? Yep, just CPU percentage. And what gets me is that CPU utilization is probably the single most abused statistic in the FinOps industry. I mean, look at all those analyst reports I just shared about the efficiency of data centers. Depending on which one you believe, it's below 50, but maybe higher than 20. Some said it's 12, others said it's 14 and 18. What are they even measuring? Every vendor that's going to sell you optimization software, every consultant with a cost-cutting pitch, they all lead with that same tired line. Oh, look at these CPU utilization numbers. You're wasting money. And I got to tell you that resonates with executives. The people sharing these numbers, I don't even know if they know it's a misleading metric, but it's easy to understand and scary looking on a PowerPoint slide. It's the perfect sales tool because it makes every infrastructure look wasteful. And I get it. I think people are going to listen to this and they're going to come back and say, well, you know, if your CPU is low on that Cassandra database, you could probably find a way to increase it. And that's true. There's probably other ways that you could find to increase these things. But on the average, what I have found is data workloads are not measured by CPU utilization. And if you do measure them by that and you try to optimize that, that has other side effects. I think it's important for us to talk about load averages, to talk about other metrics related to CPUs. But I also think it's important for us in the FinOps community to start expanding beyond just those obvious metrics. And even if you have a Mac, I have a Mac, and whenever it starts to slow down, Cursor, by the way, Cursor can get into these weird loops where all of a sudden it's consuming like 100 gigabytes of memory. And I don't have 100 gigabytes. So it's making use of swap space and it's just destroying the entire computer. And in those cases, when you go look at the CPU utilization, it might actually not be substantial, but the computer is entirely unusable. And I think you've seen other examples of it. I know you've seen this if you work in operations. When you run top, do you look at the percentage or do you look at the load average? But the point of the post that I wrote was to talk about some of the reasons why optimization isn't just a go do it sort of thing. And this is also one of the other problems. In addition to believing in these statistics like CPU utilization, there's also this sense that like, oh, well, if you just show them the report, they can optimize it. And this plays back to the way that we started this section, which is talking about the analyst reports that said, oh, overall utilization is 12% or 20%. And there's a couple reasons. I want to just go through some of the reasons why that can be the case. I'm not trying to give people excuses for not making better use of their hardware, but there are some reasons out there. First is development environments. Sometimes you have a development environment and it has to be there to support developers. And it might not be used 100% of the time, 100% of the time. People have to go on lunch break. Maybe you can dial them up and dial them down for day-night situations, but there are a lot of teams that are 24 hours. If you have an office in San Francisco and Bangalore and London, you're not dialing down the development environments and then dialing them back up every day. There is some overhead to software development that requires some infrastructure that's just going to be running and not necessarily in a optimized production environment. That shouldn't be a significant percentage of your cost, but it's going to take a couple of percentage points off of that. There's other things, new systems, double bubbles. right? If there's a new system that you're releasing to replace an old system, you may have a double bubble. And that double bubble might involve transferring traffic over to the new system. But even after you've fully transferred traffic over to the new system, the old system is going to be there because you always want to keep the old system around in case you need to fail back in an emergency. Now that might go away in a month or two, but it's those transitions that are always going to lead to less than ideal utilization. But I'll say this, if you don't have that insurance policy, you can get into real trouble. The other thing I want to point out, I said in a previous episode that the average tenure of a programmer on a project is 4.3 years. So a lot of times you have teams that just inherited software and their utilization might not be ideal. But what are you going to do? Tell them to change it immediately? Teams can only optimize systems they fully understand. And what I'll put forward for you to think about in the organization that you work in is, how many teams do you talk to where they might not have a full comprehension of their full architecture yet? Ideally, every team has their hands on their entire architecture, can change anything. But the reality is, sometimes someone will inherit something and say, I don't fully understand that yet. There's also technical debt. So sometimes an over-provisioned system is necessary because you're compensating for some bug or some problem. Let's say a system was designed by somebody who didn't fully comprehend what a relational database was, and they write queries that are just massively awful. You might have to over-provision a system. You might have to throw in a caching layer that you wouldn't need otherwise. There are so many software systems out there. Again, this can also overlap with inherited systems. If you inherit a system, or if there's a system there that's running that no one fully comprehends, sometimes you have to treat these problems with hardware. There's 1,000 other reasons. But the thing I want to throw out is you read these analyst reports and they're like, oh, the average data center is only 20% utilized. What that leaves out is telling the full story. And the full story is human software is the most difficult thing to optimize. It's that human element. One reason I've seen for people to over-provision is fear. Let's say that they've experienced an outage, and that outage was incredibly expensive. Like AWS had an outage 2 weeks ago in US East 1A. And I would put forward a theory that post-outage in that data center, almost everything is over-provisioned because no one wants to be put on the front of that investigation. And that is something that happens quite a bit. So there's all these factors that play into complicating the utilization story. But I think the most important thing, if you are working in a job where it's your job to talk about utilization and communicate it, the one thing I want to put forward as your secret weapon is empathy and understanding and communication. That's 3 things to be clear. Empathy, understanding, communication. Yes, I will agree. That's not the most scalable recipe for increasing your utilization, but I think there are 3 necessary ingredients to driving a program that helps you get to a more optimal state of cloud utilization. And if you don't use those 3 things, what you end up doing is just sending reports to teams and losing trust. So the title of my post was, It's More Complicated Than That. And I think I might have tried to get that across to you in the last couple of minutes. In our rush to optimize, we like to squeeze every penny of value from our infrastructure. We sometimes forget that these systems exist to serve business needs, and the utilization metrics aren't something to be improved by any means necessary. Good FinOps also isn't about utilization. I had a lot of times where people would say, oh, FinOps is about sending reports to people to tell them what to do. And it's like, no, that's not really what FinOps is. FinOps is about understanding the full picture, the technical constraints, the business requirements, the human factors, and finding sustainable ways to deliver value efficiently. Because at the end of the day, a system running at 50% utilization that never goes down might be more valuable than one running at 80% that fails when you need it the most. And that is a complex trade-off. And trade-offs are usually not things you can turn into reports. So thanks for listening. This has been Tim O'Brien, and I'll be back with more thoughts on technology, operations, and the complicated reality of running systems at scale. But I'm now going to go send some CPU percentage utilization reports to my customers.